Everybody, this is the last lecture and I'm going to jump right into it. So today we're talking about labeling and stigma. Social processes determine who encounters labels, and a lot of the important consequences that follows having those labels. And so what I'm going to cover again very quickly today, how labeling and stigma are conceptualized, and then how labeling and stigma affects individuals who develop mental illnesses. And so there's two types of theories we're going to talk about. One is formal labeling theory and one is modified labeling theory. So formal labeling theory is the idea that labeling causes mental illness. And so it's a straightforward relationship that once you label somebody, that then creates the label or the mental illness. And so it's the idea that labeling is influenced by social characteristics, social situations, context, culture, etc. And then once a person is labeled, social forces then produce a stable pattern of mental illness. Modified labeling theory then is similar, but doesn't say that it's a direct cause. So instead of saying that labels cause mental illness, modified labeling theory says that labeling and stigma jeopardize and negatively impact people who have mental illnesses. And so labeling can lead to disadvantage that can prolong and trigger mental illness, such as having difficulty with employment, interpersonal problems, low self-esteem, but that labeling in itself isn't what causes mental illness. And so we develop ideas of what it means to be mentally ill early in life. What it means to be mentally ill, how people will treat us if we're mentally ill, and we learn sorry about that. We learn that people with mental illnesses are devalued. And so a person with mental illness, the possibility of devaluation becomes even more relevant. And so a person with a mental illness might act less confidently or more defensively, or they may avoid potentially threatening contact, which could literally just be having a conversation with somebody. That can feel like potentially threatening contact. And so being seen as, less trustworthy, intelligent, competent, those are all examples of ways that we are, that people are devalued with mental illness. And so internalization of negative conceptions about mental illness can lead to strained relationships and interactions, a smaller social network. And so we know that comes from stigma perspective, psychiatric perspective. We know that for a variety of reasons that people with mental illnesses tend to have smaller networks. And so the internalization of these negative conceptions about mental illness are part of why that happens. A compromised quality of life, low self-esteem, experiencing depressive symptoms, experiencing unemployment, and income loss. So the thing with labeling, though, is it's not all bad. And so once you have a label, there can be a lot of good that comes from it. So the effects of labeling are both positive and negative. So when we talk about the package deal of labeling, all that means is that the good comes with the bad. There's going to be stigma that comes from having a label, but also once you have that label, you're going to be, at that point, you can work with your insurance company. You can tell people like, oh yeah, I know that I, locked that door 4 times, but I have obsessive compulsive disorder. And so there can be stigma from that, but also once you tell somebody, I have depression, I'm bipolar, think about Modern Love with Lexi. Once she told once she told her friend that she was bipolar, it was, oh, things make so much more sense now. And, her reason was that, Lexi didn't want to tell people, and that was because she anticipated stigma from the label. But also once she told her coworker, then it was, oh, everything makes sense now. And so, sorry, I know the lighting is really rough here. So the positive and the negative that come from being labeled is called the package deal. And so Link et al. And Link, the reading you read, Stigma Power, was actually written by Link. It's just a different study. But in 1997, Link did a study where he followed for 1 year. It was a longitudinal study, which means he followed them over time. And he followed men with substance abuse disorders who were seeking treatment. And so what he found was that even after being in treatment for a year, there was still a perception of stigma and experiences of discrimination that were still bothering them. And so why do I bring this up? I bring this up because even if you're getting treatment, you have the label, you're getting help for it, you're being supported, you have instrumental support, maybe material support because of it, maybe you're getting SSI checks, for example. But even if you're having positive experiences from labeling, such as getting treatment, the stigma that you experience from that label is still going to affect you. So that's the package deal. And so, whenever I say that it's in opposite directions, what I mean by that is that the receipt of services is related to quality of life in a positive direction. So having living arrangements, family relations, better financial situation. And so stigma is related to quality of life in a different direction, in a negative direction, which has negative experiences, negative impacts on people. And so people who seek mental health treatment navigate the package deal in one way or another. And this could present as avoiding treatment, this could be denying illness, or even ending treatment early. So when we think about stigma, it's about having differences, your differences being labeled as negative, and then being treated differently because of that. And so stigma has been used to describe what seems to be a lot of different concepts. So labeling, excluding, discriminating, but really stigma is just about devaluation and discrimination. And so stigma exists when the following components that I mentioned just briefly a second ago, but I'll explain more now, when these following components converge. So when people distinguish and label human differences, that's the beginning. There can't be discrimination if there's nothing to discriminate against. So the first part of stigma is distinguishing differences. And so what's true is that the vast majority of human differences are deemed not socially relevant. So your ear size, whether you have a hitchhiker's thumb, your favorite color, your favorite vegetables, there are a ton of human differences that have no real social relevance. However, there are some human differences that are awarded a degree of social salience. So your skin color, your sexual preferences, these are examples of differences that have social value. And then if you have these quote unquote, according to society, undesirable characteristics, then you can be labeled negatively because of that. And so the label difference then is linked to negative stereotypes, which then creates an us versus them mindset. And so that creates an in versus out group. So if you're stigmatizing somebody, it's because you're in a group that has higher power and you feel some kind of us versus them. They are different than you in, XYZ ways because of the stereotypes that are associated with those differences. And so social labels really demonstrate a separation between us and them. And so think about, different ethnic groups, people with mental illnesses, of course, people with different sexual orientations. And so then the perceived differences can be so intense or feel so intense that it makes it feel like the gap between us versus them is a gap between fundamentally different types of people, despite the fact that we all have a lot more in common than we do differences. And so labeled people, the takeaway from this is that people who are labeled, people who experience stigma, frequently encounter status loss and discrimination that leads to unequal outcomes. Stigma is heavily dependent on power. It's entirely dependent on social, economic, and political power. And so it's true that people in lower status groups might label themselves, they might stereotype themselves, and they might separate themselves from higher power groups. So psychiatric hospitals, for example, that's an example of people in a lower status group who are separating themselves from larger mainstream society. However, in these cases, stigma does not exist because stigma is about power. And so groups who are stigmatized don't necessarily have the power to stigmatize others. And we'll talk about stigma power in a moment. But yes, if you think of psychiatric patients in a psych ward, you can't really say that they're stigmatizing mentally healthy people because they're putting themselves in the psych ward. They're responding to the stigma against their group that was passed down from higher status groups. And so how do labeling and stigma affect people with mental illnesses? What does this actually look like? Well, there are 4 types of discrimination that I want you guys to know about: individual, internalized, interactional, and structural. So individual discrimination is really what it sounds like, that person-to-person discrimination, that prejudicial discrimination. And so individual discrimination happens when person A is basically prejudiced against person B and directly discriminates against person B. So for example, if a landlord learns that a tenant or a potential tenant was hospitalized with schizophrenia, and the landlord decides either I'm not going to rent to this person or I'm not going to renew their lease, that would be individual discrimination. The landlord is prejudiced against people with schizophrenia and then, directly discriminates against that person with schizophrenia. So a lot of what we think about with discrimination would be individual discrimination. We think about saying rude things to each other, being hurtful, and that's really the tip of the discrimination iceberg. Because as you see, there are these other examples as well. Internalized discrimination is basically the stigma perspective, or the internalized stigma perspective. And so it's discrimination that operates through the stigmatized individual. So basically, people know about the stereotypes that could be applied to them, and they experience these stereotypes as threats, which might lead them to withdraw, to avoid people, to be secretive about their disorder. And so whereas individual discrimination is one person discriminating actively against another because of prejudice, internalized discrimination is a person discriminating against themselves because of internalized stigma. So discrimination that you internalize. Interactional discrimination is similar to individual discrimination, except it really goes under the radar. This is more back and forth interactions, where it's discrimination that happens, but it typically goes unnoticed. And so if we were to use an analogy, we could say that individual discrimination would be like calling somebody the N-word, whereas interactional discrimination would be like a microaggression. It's still discrimination, but unless you're paying attention, it could go unnoticed. You might not pick up on it at all. So discrimination, but it's more interactional. And in order to pick up on it as discrimination, you'd probably have to observe multiple interactions. With individual discrimination, you can see it in a one-off action. Oh, that's discrimination. With interactional, it's something that you would kind of need to observe interactions over time because it's more hidden and less obvious. Structural discrimination then is social policy, law, institutional practices that disadvantage stigmatized groups over time. And so many health insurance companies, for example, provide less coverage for psychiatric illnesses and for physical illnesses. That's an example of social policy, institutional practices that disadvantage people with mental illnesses because it's all an illness. So there's no real reason why there should be less coverage for mental health than for physical health. So the fact that there's less coverage for mental than physical health is structural discrimination. It's discrimination that's built into the structure of the healthcare system, of the insurance system. Structural discrimination does not have to have direct or intentional discrimination. And so remember, we talked about structural racism, for example. Structural racism exists even if we don't individually treat people badly. It's really above us. And yes, we as individuals contribute to structural discrimination, but it exists beyond and above our individual actions. And so, for example, you guys, I'm not going to explain it because you read about it, not in my backyard initiatives. The movement away from institutionalization, the community-based resources, and then the backlash to moving to the community. Not in my backyard reactions have led to the mentally ill being situated in parts of the city, because the Not in My Backyard initiative is basically saying like, yeah, mentally ill people should have somewhere to live, but not in my backyard. And what does that do? It moves or it pushes mentally ill people to live in parts of the city that have high crime rates, that are unsafe, that have high pollution, high infectious diseases. And so that's an example of structural discrimination. People aren't individually saying, you know, I want you to live in a poverty-stricken neighborhood, but these Not in My Backyard initiatives pushed people in that direction, even if it wasn't one individual person saying, hey, you know, you have to go live in a poor part of the city. Okay, stigma power then, the link in Phelan article. Stigma power refers to instances in which stigma processes achieve the aims of stigmatizers with respect to the exploitation, control, or exclusion of others. So remember what I said, stigma is reliant on power. And so if stigma is something that higher status groups inflict on lower status groups, there has to be a reason why. And the reason is because there is a desire to exploit, control, or exclude. So many stigma processes serve the interests of stigmatizers. This happens in a way that's typically difficult to recognize. And so many coping mechanisms of people with mental illnesses ultimately achieve the goals of stigmatizers. And so mentally ill people who isolate themselves, who hide their behavior, who try to fit into norms, they're perpetuating efforts to, as you guys read, stay in, down, or away. And so the stigma power concept that you guys read about basically says that stigmatizers have strong motivations to keep people down, in, or away. And it's not that this is happening directly. It's not, you know, every rich person is going to every mental hospital and saying, you stay down now, you stay down. It's not happening that way. These aims are typically achieved through actions or policies that are indirect, broadly effective, so it's not typically an individual action, and then hidden and taken for granted cultural circumstances. Why do we stigmatize, and how does it look like? What does it look like? Keeping people down is one motivation for stigmatizing, and so that's exploitation and domination. And so we know, not just with mental illness, but with race and gender and various differences, that wealth, power, and high social status can be attained when one group dominates or exploits another. And so slavery, putting women in the private sphere, these are examples of times when people in power exploited and dominated lesser groups with lesser status, and they put them down. So slavery would be keeping people down. By stigmatizing Blacks as being stupid, dirty, diseased, that justified keeping them down. Keeping people in is about the enforcement of social roles. So when I say in, when Link and Phelan say in, they're referring to keeping people within social norms. And so it keeps the norm violator in, and it serves as a reminder of how to behave. Because if you don't behave according to norms, you're going to be again, stigmatized and devalued and treated badly. And so whenever somebody does go outside the norms and we punish them or judge them or discriminated against them, then that reminds other people, well, you don't want to be treated like that, so you better follow those norms. You better act normal. And then finally, keeping people away. And so avoiding disease, imagined or real. So for example, leprosy colonies. The reason that people created leprosy colonies was to keep them away, to protect the larger society. And so whether it's keeping people down, in, or away, there are motives lying behind why we stigmatize. Stigma doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are motives behind why high-powered groups have stigmatized low-power groups over time, whether it's avoiding disease, maintaining social norms, or exploitation and domination. There have been motives. But which one do we see the most with mental illness? Keeping people in. The major reason for the stigmatization of people with mental illness is an attempt to keep them in. And so initial reactions to symptoms are typically, attempts to alter rule-breaking behavior. You want to keep people in. So disapproving of beliefs or actions of people with psychosis, judging a person with depression and saying, just snap out of it, putting favorite foods in the line of sight of somebody who has anorexia. And so the way that we frequently, especially people in higher status groups, the way that we typically react to psychiatric symptoms is to try to get people to act the right way. Get out of bed, just go exercise. You know you gotta eat, you shouldn't be doing that. Have you taken your meds lately? All of those things I just said are examples of ways that we keep people in social norms. And so when efforts fail to keep people in, that's when keeping people away or down can happen. Keeping people away can be putting them in a psychiatric ward involuntarily, and then keeping people down by, judging them, putting them down can also happen, but it's really the initial motivation to stigmatize the mentally ill is about keeping people in. And again, when that doesn't work, that's whenever we see keeping people down and away. But with mental illness, the motivation for stigma is keeping people in. So what about people who are actually mentally ill? Because to this point, all I've talked about is the perspective of the stigmatizers. But what about the stigmatizee? What about the stigmatized? Does it mean that they're not also, stigmatizing themselves or experiencing, internalized discrimination? Well, no, we know that they are because we just talked about it. And so people who are mentally ill also have a concern with staying in. People with psychosis will often be concerned with staying in because they don't want to be judged. They're concerned that deviating from norms could be viewed as mental illness, could be viewed negatively. And so one way that people who are mentally ill might stay in is by concealing that they even have a mental illness. So secrecy is one way that people who are mentally ill stay in. They may keep themselves away. And so negative cultural contexts produce expectations of potential rejection. And so whereas concern with staying in would say, like, are people treating me this way because I have a mental illness? There's stigma consciousness, keeping people, and that might lead to secrecy, not telling people. But being kept away would be avoiding people or withdrawing from people. And then being kept down. So people who are mentally ill might keep themselves down by believing themselves to genuinely be of lower worth. People who have a substance abuse problem might have really low self-esteem. One, there are a lot of stigmas against people with substance abuse problems, and that can be internalized. And so all of this slide is an example of internalized discrimination. People who are mentally ill because they're aware of the stigma might try to keep themselves in the norms by not talking about their mental illness. They might keep themselves away from people by avoiding people and withdrawing. And they might also keep themselves down by having low self-esteem and putting themselves down. And so this is a diagram, an image from your reading. And so what we see here is that there's a cultural designation of value. So people with mental illness are being devalued and discriminated against, experiencing daily indignities. Then the concern with staying in comes. So stigma consciousness, secrecy, concealing it. And then if staying in doesn't work, that's where being kept away and down comes from, through avoiding, withdrawing, and having low self-esteem. And so in conclusion, the main interest of those who stigmatize people with mental illness is to keep them in. If that doesn't work, then we keep them away or down. These interests are typically not overt, and they're not typically through direct actions. They're more covert, broadly effective, and not something that you can really call on in an individual way. And so they're achieved indirectly and covertly through perceptions and behaviors of the stigmatized. Okay, so when we come right back, I will talk to you about your readings.